Welcome everyone. In this video, we're going to be ranking all of the rods currently available in the Vibes TCG. Before we start, let's talk a little bit about rods. Rods are one of the best mechanics in the Vibes TCG, in my opinion. Before we start, let's talk a little bit first just about rods in general. In my opinion, rods are one of the best designed mechanics in the game, and I think the team did a really great job with this. The reason the rod system is so great is because of the inherent luck that's involved in card games with balancing your resources. So, right, if you consider a game where you have resource cards and non resource cards throughout the game, like if you draw all your resource cards, you won't have anything to play. And if you draw all your non resource cards, you won't have any resources to play them with. And so therefore there's like a certain percentage of games, maybe like 20%, where you either have too many resources or too little resources. But the way that Vibes approaches this is it says every card can become a resource. And then there's actually this two-tier resource system within that the penguins create Pudge, but we're just really focusing on rods in this video. So because of that, it really reduces the amount of games that you lose just because you had a poor draw. The other thing that makes the rod system so nice is it allows decks to really carry way more tech cards than in other games, right? Because when you put a tech card in your deck, you're saying this card is really good in this certain situation, but in most situations it's either bad or completely useless. Well, in Vibes, you can as soon as you identify you're in a game where you don't need that card, you can just play it as a rod, and this enables those cards to be way less detrimental to be in your deck on the games they're not useful. And by allowing decks to carry more tech cards, what that really allows you to do is it allows decks to adapt much more easy to other decks. So like say that there's a deck that's really oppressive in the game in a certain situation. So for example, let's take the yellow aggressive deck. There was a time when this deck was very powerful, but then a lot of decks started carrying Popcorn Penguin. And so Popcorn Penguin, though, in certain matchups, isn't very good. So then you just play it as a rod. So in that situation, your deck has a much better chance against a yellow deck while still not really giving up that many percentage points against decks that don't carry cards that are weak to Popcorn Penguin. So that's kind of my thoughts about the rod system in general. But within the game, there's also these, I'll call them like special rods. And for these special rods, right, there are actually two types. So the first ones are colorless cards that are just basically rods themselves. And usually these have some sort of conditions attached to them. So, for example, they might say you can only play them if you control five or more rods, or they might say like enters flopped or something like that. Saucy actions are these special type of actions that can be only playable from being a rod. Right now, they all have cost of zero, although I guess in the future that might change. And so, like, I'm considering them rods for the case of this video because you have to play them as a rod in order to use them. So then the next question is, how many of these special rods should you play in your deck? So I think this is a bit of a balancing act because they do have an advantage and a disadvantage. So, right, the advantage of the special rods is you want to play cards as rods anyway. So, by having a special rod, you're basically just accomplishing two things as once. First, they produce fish, which you need anyway, but then they also have this added benefit. However, they also do have a downside for a few reasons. The first one is late in the game, they're often not very that strong. Because like if you're at the point where you're kind of top decking and you need that finisher or a really big penguin, right? The rod is usually not going to be what you need to close out the game. So they become pretty bad top decks late in the game. Also, right, we talked about tech cards earlier, right? Tech cards I kind of consider taking up the same space as special rods. So like if your deck is running like 8 tech cards or something like that, you probably don't have a lot of space for a lot of these special rods. So I think it's a bit of a trade-off of how many tech cards you want to run versus how many special rods because also what can happen is if you just have too many rods, then you just don't have cards to play. So I think in general, I found that a good balance is somewhere between 4 and 12 in a deck, and it really depends on kind of also how the deck functions, how many rods you play, right? With some decks, you play a lot of rods, and with other ones, you don't so much. When we're thinking about saucy actions in general, the other thing that can really matter if you want to play them or not is if you're a deck that really wants to win the vibe check. Because one of the cool things about saucy actions is, right, when you win the vibe check, you get a free rod. Now, if it's a special rod, it basically gets played face down, and so you don't get its ability. But saucy actions, like you play them face down anyway. So as you win the vibe check, if you get saucy actions as face down rods, it's like an added benefit because it's basically you can still use it. So in general, that's another thing to think about when trying to balance the number of special rods, saucy actions, tech cards, and then just non-rod cards. All right, so now let's jump into the tier list. So this is the way this is going to work is right now there are 15 special rods slash saucy actions in the game. I'm going to put them on this chart, rating them from tier D all the way up to tier S. Please note that the way that I'm doing the rating is their current power level. So, right, when we think about like how strong they are right now in the game, I will, however, for the ones that aren't so strong, I did do some like sub rating on basically how much potential they have to be strong in the future. Because right there's a set of rods that just aren't played right now, and so I did try to kind of organize those into ones that I think are just like good cards that just don't have the supporting deck around them, versus the ones that are just seem weak overall. All right, the first rod that we're going to talk about is Calligraphy Rod. So basically, what Calligraphy Rod says is you can only play this rod if you control 5 or more rods. So that's one of those like special rod conditions. And it says whenever you play your second penguin of this cycle, unflop your rod. So Calligraphy Rod is, I think it's a very weird rod, and it just really like has different functions of it that contradict each other. And so I think that's why it's not that strong of a rod. Because basically what it's saying is you need to have this in a deck where you're playing a lot of penguins, right? Because it's saying whenever you play your second penguin of the cycle, unflop this rod. So in order to get use out of it, you really need to play 3 penguins. So if you're playing 3 penguins in one cycle, then like you're probably a deck that's playing a lot of small penguins. But if you're playing a lot of small penguins, generally those decks, like the yellow aggressive deck, don't end up really ever getting to 6 rods because you generally don't want rods, you want penguins, and you end up really having, maybe 4 or 5 rods the entire game. So I think like because of that, it's just really like in this really awkward position. Furthermore, right, when I see this card, you start thinking like, maybe you could make some like crazy combo with this. But the problem is it doesn't say like whenever you play your second, third, fourth, fifth, any penguin after your second unflop it, so you could get some sort of like infinite fish machine out of it. You really only get the payoff is only one bonus fish. So because of all of that, this card is definitely not played right now, and I just don't really see a future where it's going to be played. Maybe there's some sort of deck in the future that uses it, but I think it's pretty unlikely just because of the like way the nature of this card works is it just kind of has these like contradicting abilities. So because of that, this calligraphy rod goes into tier D. The next rod on our list is Freezing Rod. So Freezing Rod says this produces 2 fish. Whenever you use this rod, ice a rod you control. Now, unlike Calligraphy Rod, I think Freezing Rod does have a potential to be in some sort of deck, right? Because like producing 2 rod for a fish is really is really powerful. Like, anytime that there's any sort of mana ramping ability, you always have to take it seriously. But the cost is so strong here. It's like basically you ice a rod. So, even though you can ramp mana, you end up icing a rod. Now, there might be some sort of deck where the icing a rod you control ends up being a positive thing. So, right, there are already cards that take advantage of this. So, for example, I forget the name of it, but there's like a penguin that says like whenever you ice a rod, give it +2, put +2 counters, put a +2 vibe counter on it. Or yeah, there's some other like mechanics that work with icing rods. So if there ever becomes this like rod icing deck that is super strong, then freezing rod could have a place in it. But I also think like in that situation, right, we would have to have some really good payoff cards. Like, so for example, maybe if there was a card that said like, whenever you ice a rod, draw a card, or something like that. If there was some sort of like really, really powerful combo like that, then I could see Freezing Rod being like a staple in that deck. But right now we don't really have that. So because of that, this also goes into tier D. The next rod is going to be our first saucy action. And for that, I'm referring to Sick Pull. So Sick Pull is the purple saucy action. So what Sick Pull says is you can only play this action if it's face down as a rod. So, right, that's the just mechanic that all saucy actions have. And it says flip this card over to play it. Each player draws a card. So first, just on its face, this card is just absolutely terrible because it's just card disadvantage. So, right, you're going to play Sick Pull, and then both people draw a card. So the net effect is you've spent a card to draw a card, and they draw a card. So you're down 1 card advantage. And you're also down rods. You've basically given up a rod. So it really isn't very good just on its face by itself. So then the question is, how do you use this rod? And for that, I can think of two scenarios. So the first scenario would be you have some sort of deck that really takes advantage of you of cards getting drawn. So, right, you could think about that as like, right, there are these like blue decks that have like Penguin Who's Okay, maybe some Orb of Hopium, stuff like that, where it's like really focused around really drawing as many cards as possible. But I think there's much better options for that. Like I said, like Orb of Hopium, which doesn't have card disadvantage and repeats over and over. Plus, the payoffs really aren't there yet. Like Penguin Who's Okay, I think is the only real payoff card, and that card already has so much support within blue. So I'm not really sure that sick pull is really needed for that. The second thing is as a tech card. So if you're playing against like a Bismo type deck that's trying to win by emptying their deck, or you're playing some sort of blue deck where you're trying to empty their deck, it can really be that finisher to just um, get them to lose the game by making them draw a card when their deck is empty. However, when you think about how the current like BizBunk deck is structured, they do their combo not during the action phase, but during the like play penguin phase. So because of that, Sick Pull doesn't really even fit really well in this tech card slot either. So because of that, it also is going to go into tier D. All right, moving on to tier C. So I think in general, tier C is just like tier D, where they're not getting a lot of play or any play at all. But I think these cards have a little more potential. The first one is Rod of Camaraderi. So the way that Rod of Camaraderi says is it says enters flopped as additional cost to play this rod. Ice 3 unflopped rods you control. This rod produces fish for each penguin in your huddle. So, right, when you just look at it in just a regular deck, this seems really expensive, right? So you're icing 3 rods in order to produce what is this going to produce? Maybe four fish or something like that, right? The break even point is you have to have at least 4 penguins, and then this is even. Plus, it enters flopped. However, right, there could be some sort of deck in the future, like some sort of aggressive deck that has some sort of finisher that is a really heavy fish finisher. So, right, like with a yellow aggressive deck, you frequently can end up with like 8, 9 penguins. And so this rod together, with that type of setup, could allow you to play some really big finisher. So, right, maybe there's some sort of aggressive deck that just absolutely wins a game with some sort of big finisher, and this rod is kind of the bridge in order to get you there. So when we think, for example, of the yellow aggressive deck right now, there are like the finishers like Pleaflum, right? They're strong, but what they are is they basically just say like, "Hey, just play like this really big penguin." But the problem is a really big penguin doesn't really win you the game, right? If you just play a really big penguin, all they have to do is just ice that penguin, and it's not really a finisher that ends a game. But if there was some sort of finisher that just basically made you win the game on the spot, then that cost maybe 10 fish or something like that. And maybe you had some sort of way to unflop this after you play it. So you could basically have some penguin that said, like, whenever you play a rod, unflop a rod. And then you had some sort of finisher that cost 10 fish. And then you could just basically play this rod, unflop your other rod, and then flop this to play the win condition. I could see a deck like that where this rod could become very powerful. But as you can hear me talking through it, right, that's a lot of ifs of cards that don't exist yet. So until that happens, this rod is, I think, also not very strong, which is also why it's going to go into tier C. The next rod is a rod that I really, really want to make work, and I've tried it a bunch, but I just never seem to be able to get value from it, and that's Umbrella Rod. So, Umbrella Rod says you can only play this rod if you control 5 or more rods. Whenever you play your 4th action of the cycle, copy it. You make new choices for the copy. So, right, this naturally would fit into some sort of red spell deck. But I think one of the challenges with this rod is, right, we already have Carnival Penguin, and Carnival Penguin is just such a stronger effect, and it says that you only need to play, your 3rd action, right? On with Carnival Penguin, on your 3rd action, you can, ice a penguin with vibe 6 or less, and Umbrella Rod basically just copies the action. So, right, it could be strong, and I feel like in the right red deck, it might work. I think the other reason that this rod just isn't very played right now is just Red Mega Penguin is so strong. And I think Red Mega Penguin's playstyle doesn't necessarily work that well with Umbrella Rod because with Red Mega Penguin, you're really just trying to like play your actions as you draw them, not really build up for this like kind of big combo turn. So because of that, I think yeah, I think Umbrella Rod just hasn't really found its groove yet. But I could see a world where there's some sort of action-based deck, maybe one that's not red, because I think that's the other thing where like red already has Carnival Penguin and a Red Mega Penguin, which I think are both stronger than this. But right, maybe there's going to be some sort of action-based deck that's not red that really would like some sort of like payoff for playing a lot of actions. And in that case, Umbrella Rod could be a centerpiece of that deck. So because of that, it becomes also tier C. So far, the 5 rods we've talked about have seen almost no play, but this next rod, the final one in tier C, is one that I do actually see people playing in decks sometimes, and that is Rod of Charming Melodies. So this says you can only play this rod if you control 5 or more rods. Whenever you use this rod, ice the top 2 cards of your deck. So I have seen certain BizBunk lists playing this. But I think personally that those lists are just not the strongest builds. So, right, this is good at icing your own deck, but the problem with that mechanic is there are just way better ways to ice your own deck. Like Ascending Penguin plus a Bashful Swordsman, or Ascending Penguin plus a what's it called? The Penguin Who Breaks the Fourth Wall, or Penguin Who's Okay with Brainy Penguin. There's just like way stronger mechanics to ice your own decks. And then the other thing with this is, right, the current Bismuth builds, like they often don't get to 6 rods for a while. Like it's just one of those decks where because you're sometimes icing your own rods with Penguin Who Breaks the Fourth Wall, it just can be a bit of a take a little bit of time to get to 6 rods, also because you're usually losing the vibe check. So because of all that, I don't think that this rod really fits that great into that deck, but I have seen some people playing it, so I think there's potential there. And there definitely could be some sort of if there's some sort of different build of the kind of Bizbunk deck where you're not really relying on Ascending Penguin, because right, maybe there's some sort of maybe it's like a longer grindy type of deck. Because like one of the really nice things about this rod is you don't actually like you just every turn you play something and the effect just kind of happens in the background. So, like because it's like this kind of like repeating effect that happens over and over, like in a really long grindy game, this rod could become very powerful. So, I think there is potential for it and it's already being used a little bit. So, yeah, so I think because of that, I'm just going to put it in tier C. All right. Now we're in tier B, and the first rod in tier B is another rod that I see very rarely played, but still played nonetheless in some versions of BizBunk, and that's Pudgy Man Rod. So this says whenever a rod is put into your ice from play, unflop this rod. So this is the rod that also gets that's like part of that like, hey, we want to get a payoff from icing rods. And so like right in BizBunk, you do have like Penguin Who Breaks the Fourth Wall. And so together with Pudgy Man Rod, I've seen people do this and then they just end up drawing a decent amount of cards. So like they will or getting a decent amount of fish, right? So you have like a Pudgy Man Rod, you play a fourth wall, you unflop Pudgy Man Rod, and kind of that cycle continues. I think one of the nice things about this rod is there's no cap on it. Like it doesn't say like you can only use this effect once a turn, which is different than Calligraphy Rod, which was very specific and limited in that respect. So, yeah, so I have seen this rod used. Personally, I don't think it's that good. And I kind of, maybe I would have put it actually down in tier C, except for the way that my template works. I can only put 3 things in every tier. So because of that, I think it's a very close to the tier C cards. But I have seen it played more than the other cards. So because of that, I will put it in tier B. The next rod is actually one of the rods that has probably been played the most of all the rods in the game, but not for the reason you're thinking. And that is Trampoline Rod. So Trampoline Rod is in the yellow starter deck, which is the most common starter deck for people to play. And so a lot of people's first introduction to special rods is through Trampoline Rod. And what this says is enters flopped. When you play this rod, return a penguin in your huddle to its owner's hand. Now, the yellow starter deck is basically the perfect deck for this card because that deck really wants you to continue to bounce penguins in and out of play. Especially because you can bounce with Trampoline Rod, Penguin Who Zooms, who then can bounce back another Rod or another Penguin. And so when you have your like payoff card, which is your extrovert Penguin, or maybe your shy Penguins, you can just really get a ton of Penguins in and out of play, which makes the extrovert really big. But I think the thing that really like shows the kind of limit of this rod is we basically already have a deck, the yellow starter deck, which is completely optimized around this rod. Like I don't think you could build a more perfect deck around this rod. We've also really extensively tested this because we've given basically every player access to it, and it's still not that good of a deck. So, because of that, like I think it is kind of a middle of the pack rod because like unlike these other rods we've talked to, this is the first one that actually has a deck that is capable of getting to dummy thick that is built around the rod. I mean, it's not really built around the rod, but the rod is like a key part of that deck. Um, but it's really not the best deck out there. And I think we've really seen the ceiling of what this rod can accomplish, at least in the current set. Maybe if like new cards came out that were a lot more focused on this bouncing mechanic, or there was some card that was just so important, had such a strong coming into the huddle ability that you really needed to play it twice, then yeah, then maybe this card could see some more play. Right, yeah. The more I think about it, right? If there was some card, like let's say there was like 4 Pudge card that was just super, super strong when it came into play, right? You could wait till you had 8 rods on the board, play Trampoline Rod, and then play it again. And you're also not really limited to the color. So it's kind of like an extra, kind of like Penguin Who Zooms is kind of the same thing. So if there was this type of deck concept, then yeah, Trampoline Rod could fit into it. So because of all that, I'm going to put it in tier B. The next rod is another saucy action, which is the one from Blue, which is Cool Story Bro. And so, right, it's a saucy action that says choose a player and ice the top 2 cards of their deck. So this card has definitely seen a decent amount of play in various blue decks. I think one of the challenges with blue decks is we still really haven't figured out the right way to build blue. I've seen so many different ways and iterations in blue, and I've spent so many times trying to make blue decks myself, and there still hasn't been something that's broken through and really been established as the best blue deck out there. And I think the reason for that is just blue isn't that strong right now. And so the reason we haven't settled on a strong build is I'm not sure that there is one. But within the blue decks, Cool Story Bro can actually serve 2 different functions. So the first one is it can really get you over that 15 card in your opponent's ice breakpoint, which is needed in order to play Send It Too Hard, right? I frequently had decks where I'm like often having a Send It Too Hard in my hand, and my opponent is at 11 cards in their ice or 13 cards in their ice, and I just can't get over the finish line in order to clear the board, and then I lose the game. But with Cool Story Bro, I can it can just be that thing that pushes them over to 15 cards. You then play it Send It Too Hard, and then you end up winning the game just because that effect of clearing the board is just so strong with how the blue deck wants to work. The other thing that this can do is really help at the end of the game. So, right, your opponent will be planning out, okay, so I have 6 cards left in my ice, so I can survive one more turn. So I'll play like this in order to win the game. And then boom, you at that point maybe have 2 or 3 Cool Story Bros on the board. You play those, you get them down, and then they lose the game without getting that one more turn. So it can kind of act as a finisher, and as well as an enabler for Send It Too Hard. So because of that, I think this card definitely has seen a decent amount of play. But I think the real main challenge with it is just the deck color it's in. Blue is just a deck that just really hasn't found its footing yet. And so because of that, it's still not that powerful. And that's why it goes into tier B. All right, now we're on to tier A. So the first rod in tier A is Hot Rod. So Hot Rod, on its face, when I first saw this card, I was like, this card is absolutely terrible. It says basically you can only play this rod if you control 5 or more rods. At the start of action time, boost the vibe of the penguin in your huddle with the highest vibe by 1 for the rest of the cycle. If it's a tie, you pick. So it just seems like such a minor benefit, right? You're just improving the vibe by 1 of the highest vibe penguin. But the thing with this rod is there's a deck that actually was one of the best decks in the game, if not the best deck, at least at the time, and it played 4 copies of this rod. And I'm talking about the Green Mega Penguin deck. So the Green Mega Penguin Caffeine deck. So the reason that Hot Rod works so well in this deck is it was all about playing a Green Mega Penguin and boosting its vibe as much as you can. And the thing about Green Mega Penguin is since it can't be targeted by anything, Hot Rod actually still can target it because as long as it's the highest vibe penguin, right, Hot Rod will boost it by one because, right, it can't be chosen by anything, but Hot Rod doesn't choose anything because it says the word pick, not choose. So it's this like really weird pedantic thing about how the rules of the game work. And so, like, in the Green Mega Penguin mirror match, which was at the time when Green Mega Penguin was just absolutely running rampant on the ladder, right? You ran into the mirror match a lot. And for the mirror match, it was all just about getting your Green Mega Penguin down as quickly as possible and then boosting it with inspiring story and Hot Rod as much as possible. And I played many games where it was just about like drawing that extra Hot Rod was the thing that pushed you over the finish line. So I think on its face, this rod is actually not that strong, but there was this like deck that really used it to its fullest ability. And so when it was being used to its fullest ability, it was actually in a top tier deck. So because of that, it earns a spot in tier A. The next rod in tier A is not a rod anymore. So this is the red saucy action. And basically what it says is choose a penguin and boost its vibe by 2 for the rest of the cycle. So not a rod anymore is a basically a counter card, a kind of tech card against Gotham, which is the green saucy action that basically says choose a penguin with a vibe 2 or less and ice that penguin. So a lot of decks have started playing not a rod anymore with the sole purpose of countering Gotham. There are currently, right, the Bizbunk deck often plays 4 copies of this, but I've even seen this frequently played in the yellow deck. On top of that, if you play like the red starter deck or some like kind of variation of the like kind of more tempo red deck, that often also plays this rod because it can be very useful at activating Peace Out Penguin. Or if you're playing Drop of Attention, not a rod anymore can also be used in order to get to that spell count in order to get Drop of Attention done. So right now, it is actively being played in the best deck or one of the best decks, which is Bizbunk. It is kind of still a tech card in some other decks, such as yellow, and there is a red starter deck that uses it. And I think there's this concept of a deck, which is this like tempo red control deck, which I think would end up running this card. It just needs a few more cards to get there. So this rod is very versatile. It definitely already has found a few places that it would go. And so because of that, it also goes into tier A. The final tier A rod is Rod of Cheesy Slices. So this rod is just a cornerstone of every blue deck, in my opinion. That needs like I think if you're playing blue, you need to be playing Rod of Cheesy Slices. And it says you can only play this rod if you control 5 or more rods. Whenever you use this rod, choose an opponent and ice the top 2 cards of their deck. What makes this rod so strong is the effect triggers turn after turn after turn. And with blue, you're often trying to grind out your opponent. And so, like, if you can get down 1 or 2 Rod of Cheesy Slices, you can very quickly grind down out their deck. So, right, with blue, it's all about getting first to 15 cards in their ice so that you can play Send It Too Hard. Then you clear the board, but then you have that kind of like second phase where you have to actually fully remove their deck. And Rotted Cheesy Slices by itself is often enough to accomplish this. So, and by the time you get to that stage, you getting the like 6 rod condition is also not really that hard for blue because blue does it's kind of like a mid-rangey deck in terms of winning the vibe check. So, yeah, so I think the main thing holding this deck back is actually just the general power level of blue. So I think like if there was a blue deck that was really strong, it would be running this, and then we would be saying it's one of the strongest rods in the game. So I think like unlike Cool Story Bro, which is like a nice like utility helper in the deck, I think Rod of Cheesy Slices, whenever we have a strong blue deck, is going to be one of the corner pieces of that deck. So because of that, it's going to go into tier A. All right, now we're at tier S. So our first tier S rod is going to be Bounce House Rod. So Bounce House Rod is just one of those like utility cards that just pops up in so many decks across the game, including some of the best decks, such as Green Aggro or Green Midrange or Green Caffeine Mega Penguin. But I've also seen all sorts of other decks run this as well. It's one of those cards that you can really slot into any deck. And this card is just really so central to how the rod system works, and it really kind of takes advantage of that. So Bounce House Rod says, enters flopped. When you play this rod, return a rod you control to its owner's hand. So one of the kind of tricky things early in the game is you'll typically have a bunch of cards in your hand and you'll have some like late game cards, like maybe your finisher spells or so your really big penguins. And you don't want them in the early game, so you play them as rods. But then when the late game comes around, you really wish you had kept them in your hand the whole game. And so what Bounce House Rod lets you do is you draw the Bounce House Rod late in the game, and then you can just trade it in for one of those other really powerful late game cards that you played in the beginning of the game. Now, it's especially strong in decks where you have like a kind of an end game combo. So, for example, if you're playing a deck that relies on like a two-card combo to end the game, right? You can keep Bounce House Rod, and as soon as you draw one of those combo pieces, if you have another one as a rod, you can end up picking that up. So you kind of have the flexibility of which of your combo pieces you get based from all the rods you have. The other type of deck that really, really thrives with Bounce House Rod are decks where you win the vibe check a lot. Because when you're winning the vibe check, you get a lot of rods played for you from the top of your deck that you don't have control. So sometimes you end up getting a key card, like maybe a popcorn penguin, played on the top of from the top of your deck into your rods, and then with Bounce House Rod, you're able to bring them back in your hand. So because of all of this, Bounce House Rod is super flexible. I've seen it in so many decks, including tier 1 decks or tier S decks. So because of that, it's going to go into tier S. Our next rod is going to be another saucy action, which is going to be What a Twist. So What a Twist is just all over the place right now. And the reason for that is it is a rod that counters one of the two of the biggest finishers in the game right now. So green decks often love playing Everybody Stay Clam, which ends up flopping all the penguins. Or there's also the caffeine deck, which plays too much caffeine, which also will end up flopping your penguins. And What a Twist, what it says is you can only play this action if it's face down as a rod, and then flip this card over to play it, choose a penguin, and unflop it. So, What a Twist enables you to kind of counteract these flopping effects. Oh, on top of that, Hungry Penguin is also often played, which flops your penguins. So, What a Twist is this like way to kind of it's like a tech card to counterplay those other decks which are trying to flop your penguins. Or in the case of Everybody Stay Clam, it's actually part of this two card combo win condition. So, What a Twist, like, right. So, you can basically play Everybody Stay Clam, flop all the penguins, then play What a Twist, unflop one of your penguins, and then you win the vibe check. And if that's the final vibe check, you win the game. So, What a Twist is like, yeah, so it's part of these combos that win the game in some of the best decks in the game, or it's part of other decks play it in order to kind of have a chance to like counteract those combos. So, it's also very easy to put into any deck because there are also like secondary use cases for it. So, for example, the red Mega Penguin mid-range deck, if you play this card in there and play it on a red Mega Penguin, you can actually unflop two penguins, and that deck is often really, really needing a Pudge, and so you can then maybe unflop your red Mega Penguin and your Wizard Penguin in order to get more Pudge to kind of push you over the edge to pull off a big combo. So it also can like kind of slot into other decks. And unlike some cards like Not a Rod anymore or like Cool Story Bro, sometimes there's just other reasons you wanna play this rod. Like, like, it's not a dead card nearly as often, just because, like, unflopping a penguin in order to produce extra pudge, right? There can be situations where that's useful. So, for example, if you're playing yellow and you're maybe just you just need to get enough pudge to play a Yum Yum, but you have three pudge on board and you have a wizard penguin in your hand. Well, you can play the wizard penguin, but it enters flopped. But with What a Twist, you can unflop it and then play that Yum Yum. So, right, there are some like niche situations where that extra pudge can become really useful. So, because of all of that, What a Twist goes into tier S. So, now for the final rod, you probably have deduced already what it is, and it's the green saucy action, which is Got 'em. So, Got 'em basically says you can only play this action if it's face down as a rod, flip this card over to play it, choose a penguin with vibe 2 or less, ice that penguin. There are so many decks that play Gotham right now. It's basically whenever I'm building a deck, the first thing I do is put 4 Gothams in. So Gotham is just a card that really works well against certain decks. Like for example, against any deck running Penguin Who's Okay or Ascending Penguin. It's also a really good counter against Daydreaming Penguin, but it's also really good in situations where, like, if your opponent is trying to play a finishing combo, right, they will often do this when they're on 14 permanents. So they're on 14 permanents. Maybe they play their like everybody stay clam, what a twist combo, or their put your flippers in the air, or their buddy up. And then you play got 'em and just knock them back down to 13 permanents. So yes, they win that vibe check, but they don't win the game. And now they've used up their combo pieces, their finisher pieces, and now they, the next turn, they don't have their finisher anymore. So it's super versatile, because you can in the early game you can remove key penguins. In the late game, you can prevent them from winning the game. It's also really good at counteracting. So, for example, if you're playing against purple, right, they might use Adventure Squad, where they're trying to like they have to choose a penguin on their side of the board and one on your side of the board, and then ice the one that's vibing the least, but or the most. But with Gotham, you can then remove the penguin on their side of the board in order to fizzle that action. So right, it can do a lot of counterplay. So there's just a lot of situations where Gotham comes into play. Or like another example with a counterplay is like, right, your opponent plays put your flippers in the air on a penguin that has 2 vibe, you can just play Gotham, remove that penguin, and then the put your flippers in the air fizzles. So there's like all these situations where you can use it to fizzle actions as well. So it's great in the early game to remove key threats. It's great in the mid game to fizzle actions, and it's great in the late game to prevent your opponent from getting to 14 or to getting to 15 and after they've played their finisher. So because of all of this, yeah, Gotham is, in my opinion, the strongest rod in the game right now, and it gets the final spot in tier S. All right, so there you have it. This is my ratings of all the rods that are available in the game right now. If you disagree with any of my ratings, please let me know in the comments, because this was definitely very subjective on kind of my opinions about them. And yeah, if you like this type of video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you want to, yeah, if you want to find out or get notified when there's new videos coming. All right, until next time. Thanks everyone.